Hello, this is the first lesson where I'll get you to use your alcohol markers. I know it's a long time coming. If you've done the other lessons so far, then they're important. They're good to help you kind of build up that kind of foundational knowledge. But if you jump straight here, fantastic, that's all good. So this is the kind of getting started stage of using alcohol markers. It's easy to kind of skip past this. It's quite easy to kind of go, do you know what, I'm not going to go through the foundations, I just want to get cracking with making the illustrations. So if you've gone straight to tutorials and come back here, then I'm glad to see you. They are quite, it can be quite challenging jumping straight in. You know, I'm the kind of person who takes a user manual and throws it out the window. I'm not interested. When I buy something new, I'm like, do you know what, I just want to get on and play with it. That's cool, that's totally fine. And often you'll find that the best way to learn is actually playing with those things. But this stage is kind of foundational. It is kind of playing with it and kind of getting to know your markers a little bit better so that actually later on things get easier. And building up that foundational knowledge it is important, it is useful. You don't need to do it if you want to skip ahead and you want to play around in your own time, that's great. But if you've come here for the course, I'm assuming that you want to build up some of that foundational knowledge. So we're going to do this kind of getting started lesson. So if you've been through the other lessons before, you see that I've got my protective space. I've got this rubber matting that comes with my Ohuhu markers, just to keep anything from really staining when I get to using these markers. For paper, I've gone with something that's quite absorptive. So this is my go-to paper. I love this kind of paper. I mentioned it, I don't know if I actually mentioned it in the picking paper type, but it's one that I pick all the time. I'll show you the brand just in case it's something that you can get. It might not be available to you. So it's this this block of paper, 170 grams per square meter, quite absorptive. It's, you know, you can probably get this 170 gram per square meter, but in card and be quite smooth. But it's always worth playing around picking your paper type. So if you haven't done that lesson on paper just yet, might be worth going to check that out. If you have, I'm guessing that you've got a paper that you're quite happy with using. And a part of this kind of getting started stage, if you go through it and you go, do you know what, I'm not happy with the paper that I've chosen, you can just repeat the process and go back and find a paper that you do like. That is an important part, is finding the stuff that you enjoy, finding the stuff that makes it a pleasurable experience for you. For example, in the paper types, I don't particularly like stone paper for alcohol markers. Love it for other different techniques, but it's not my favorite for using alcohol markers. So that is something to bear in mind. Go back, pick a type of paper that you like, try it again. There's no rush, there's no hurry in getting started. You can always repeat the process as much as you need to get comfortable with the markers. So I've got my paper, got my protective matting, and my first thing that I do when I get alcohol markers, and actually not just when I just get a new set of alcohol markers, I do this every single time I create something. I might not do it to this extent, but that is swatching. So I'm going to take the markers that I've got. I'll pick a few. I will show you how I go about making a swatch. And actually I've got one here from before when I received these Artful pens. So I got these in a subscription. I essentially went through, Artful very kindly actually sent a swatch through. So it came with this piece of paper. You can see that it's got the brand on the top. And it's got these boxes. So it basically gives you a chance to apply the pigment to paper and get a feel for how those markers look. I'm essentially going to repeat this process today so that you don't need to get one of these branded piece of papers with your alcohol markers. You may well find, for example, who did the same, came with these little predetermined bits of card with the name of the pen, the code, and essentially gives you a box to apply those pigments as well. So these are great. If they come with your pens, fantastic. But the reason for me doing it almost every single time that I actually go and use these pens is it's kind of twofold. For one, for example, if these pens are quite old, so these Ohuhu markers are getting on a bit, it might be the case that the pigment I put down before on these swatch cards could have changed. They could have either degraded, the saturation may have changed, the the volume of the ink inside may have changed, and that could actually affect the color that comes out. So that's why I tend to make at least this kind of swatch, if not quite to the same extent. I at least have a scrap bit of paper to keep myself company every time that I make an illustration. You'll see that when we go on to do those illustrations later on in the course. But I always have at least a scrap bit of paper of the same type of paper that I'm going to be using for the illustration. That's so I know that the ink that I'm using is going to be just what I need it for later on. Another good reason for this is you can see that this swatch card is very white, and that the paper I tend to use is more cream or off-white. And it's the same for this Artful swatch as well. It's very white card, and if I'm using a cream paper, I know for a fact that this pigment is going to be different between the two. So making a swatch is just, it saves you so much time. It saves you that ability of when you go to make an illustration and you pick a pen, you go, oh, I want this, I want R1, I want this kind of pastel-y colour, I want this coral pink. I want this colour, it looks good on here, perfect, just what I need, and you put it straight on your illustration, but because you haven't swatched it beforehand, that colour could look different, and then it could essentially ruin what you're working on, and I don't want that to happen for me. It's not a fun experience, especially if you're later on in an illustration, and you add this colour and you go, it feels like I've ruined it, I have to go back and do it again. So save yourself some time and always swatch beforehand. So I'm going to do that, I'm going to write out a few boxes, so I'm going to get a pencil. And I'm going to just make a few boxes, and I'll show you how I will go about making a swatch card for myself with the kind of details I provide, just so that I know the pen that I'm using is what I want to be using for my illustration. So what you need for this is your paper and a pencil. Pencil's quite nice because when you draw over the top of it in alcohol markers, it's not going to do anything to the pigment below or the graphite below. You might find it interacts with other things, but that's not always the case. Coloured pencil, for example, is a good way to do it, but if you've got a graphite pencil, you can always draw over the top in a pen to make it more defined afterwards, but just sketch out some boxes using a graphite pencil. You could, if you wanted to, use a ruler to make this more kind of precise. I'm just going to go ahead and make some boxes. I'll do a few here. If you've got a large set like I have, and you're not going to be using all the colours necessarily all the time, it's okay to make smaller swatch cards. But if you want to go ahead and swatch all the colours, that's great. So I'm actually just going to draw a few boxes here, do the top row. So we'll see how many we can fit in. I'll try and get 5 in here. Not quite even. If you want to be precise, go ahead. I know I can understand wanting to have a nice kind of example swatch card. I tend to do these often enough that I just go, do you know what, a box like that will do. So we'll take some colours. We'll go with this nice coral pink. We'll go with this pastel violet. We'll go with this green, glass green. They've all got names on if you've got the same markers as I have. We'll go with this marigold, and I'll pick one more. We'll go with this cloud blue. So what I do is I will take the information. So for example, this is P89 cloud blue. I know that this is my Ohuhu markers. Kind of right over the top, my Ohuhu. Obviously you'll find that you might have a P89 in Copic markers and it'll be a completely different colour. So having that reference will help you just to know what you're swatching. So I'm going to write just below the box it's PB9, sorry. PB9, not P89. Cloud blue. This is just how I do it. I don't tend to put a lot of precision into it just because it's more of a guide anyway, but it's a good thing to have. So I'm going to take one of the ends. I like to swatch with the brush nib just because more ink tends to come out. And I'll actually just do a layer on the far left. And I will then, if I've got the brush nib, pull out a few strokes to show what it looks like when it's not super saturated. So you can get an idea for what kind of pigment that this pen puts down. And I might then try the bullet as well. So I know that if I'm just putting the bullet down, I get kind of a mid-tone. If I use the brush nib, if I apply it quite heavily in the far left, I can get a very dark pigment. And if I swipe it over, I get a lighter pigment as well. So I've used an absorptive paper, and you can see the ink has done what it wants to do. It does what it wants to do, and it's about getting comfortable with that. So you could put a lot of precision, a lot of detail into making the perfect swatch card, but it's just being aware that the ink may well just go, do you know what, I'm not going to stay inside your box, I'm going to leave. So that's something that I take into account as well, being aware of it. So I've swatched one, and I'll do the same for the rest. So I'll apply the heaviest pigment on the left, using the brush nib, back and forth maybe, swipe over to get some lighter pigment, and then do some lines with, say, the bullet nib if I've got a bullet nib. And then I will write below it, this was YR2 Marigold. Whatever I just spell. And then I'll do the same with the next one. Heavy pigment. Swipe a few over to get that lighter look. And that's what this opportunity gives you, is that ability to show you, what the brush nibs do, what kind of variety in color and pigment you can get with that nib, with that pen as well. And you've got a reference for yourself. When I actually am working on something, I don't go to this extent. I don't go and make a swatch like this for every illustration I'm doing. All I simply do is I take a scrap bit of paper and I will just draw a few strokes using that pen, just so I know that it's the colour that I'm looking for. You'll find, this one's quite a nice match for pigment and cap, but you could go, oh, that colour looks right, based on the cap, but then actually when you go ahead and you draw with it, it's not going to be necessarily the same. So doing a swatch is very useful. And you can see as well how the pigment dries. So this is dried quite a bit lighter than what it was before. And this is just a good way to show you that even though the ink might go down looking like this, it tends to go down darker than when it's dried. And that's the important point of swatching as well, is that that once you've applied it, you can see what it looks like once it's dried, and give yourself a good idea of how it's going to affect your illustration. So, done all these. This is just a mini swatch to show you what I go through. And we can actually look at these colours to see if they are in fact very different from before. So we've got Cloud Blue. There's actually quite a good match there, even though that the paper is different, but I still maintain that it's worth swatching because you don't know necessarily if that's going to be the case. I would say that this is almost greener than this one. It would make sense, the cream is kind of yellowy, so it's bringing out the, adding the yellowy kind of tone to the blue makes it slightly greener. The Marigold is quite a nice match. It's slightly darker. When I've applied the heavy pigment here, it would make sense. The paper is darker, so it would bring out that darker pigment. Coral Pink, again, slightly darker for the paper that I'm going to use for my illustrations. Pastel Violet, again, I would say quite significantly darker between this one and that one. And also Glass Green as well. Slightly darker, slightly kind of almost greener because of that yellowy off-white creamy colour of the paper. So it does affect it, and this is basically why I think it's so important to remember to swatch, not just when you first get your pens, but before you do your illustrations as well.